I wanted Mahesh to sit on that side because it's the better side.
Oh, wow.
You know, better in cameras.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So
I need all the help.
So Mahesh is a friend and he was also my neighbor. So I just want to keep it, personal and fun, and Mahesh, if you're okay with that. So I just wanted to set some personal context as to how we wanted to do this event together, right? So one of the evenings I actually showed up at Mahesh's house, and because I come from a background in venture capital, we started talking about the industry, and the discussion went on for good 4 hours, to an extent where his lovely wife had to like gently nudge me out of the house, right? So it was unbelievably exciting for me, and I think as a venture capitalist, I do have to say that many of us in the industry owe our career in a way to telecom and mobile and data, right? Because of everything that's panned out in digital. So I'm super happy to be doing this today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Can we start off by talking about, um, you know, um, what was it like in the very beginning? So what was, the early 90s in India like during, just when the country was getting liberalized, right? What was the sector like back then, and where are we today?
Well, thanks, Varsha, and thank you everybody for being here on of all days, Sunday morning. So, thank you. To your question, Varsha, the telecom sector was then in the 1980s and 90s an entirely government operation. Sorry, was an entirely government operation. The government was running the services across the country through its Department of Telecoms. The exceptions were Delhi and Mumbai, where a government company, MTNL, ran the show. And the capacity of that network at that time was barely 8 million, which is less than 120 times of what we have today. It also had close to 25 lakh or 2.5 million people waiting for a connection. The connection itself could take years to come by. And I'm sure there are any number of people in this very audience who have their own favorite telephone story. And the quality of service was, of course, quite a challenge. And in fact, it was not uncommon for phones to be dead for weeks on end for many times. So it was a grim scene at that time. It's not that people hadn't tried doing or tried reform, and there have been 2 or 3 major efforts at that. There was one, of course, which was led by Sam Pitroda in the Rajiv Gandhi government, where basically the idea was that rather than take phones to people's homes, why don't we just provide telephone access through public access telephone booths, which was immensely successful. And the other was, of course, to try and reduce dependence on equipment that was almost entirely imported. So we had something called the Center for Development of Telematics that he helped set up, which was able to produce equipment, quite important equipment, which was actually able to withstand Indian temperatures and Indian dust levels. And that too was a major success. Having said all that, it's absolutely true that we were struggling because even in the early 90s, when I got involved in the sector, uh, India's telecom sector, coverage was a major contrast to the rest of the developed world, where you had a situation where in North America, most of Europe had pretty much 100% connectivity across the countries. You could get a phone over a day, in a day, etc. But in India, you had weeks, and not just weeks, months and years to wait for. So it was in desperate need of reform. And that is pretty much what it was then.
I'm actually more curious about your personal entry into this space, right?
Mm.
Because you were a chemist before this. So how did a chemist end up landing in a room full of 5 people who were, given the task to set up this regulatory body, right? It's quite fascinating. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, as I like to say, I'm a failed chemist. I did, I did live off chemistry for many years in various academic places, but I was keen to move into communications because I came from an IT kind of a background. So I had actually done a course in communication policy in London, and at a time when actually telecom deregulation was taking place across the world. As you know, till the mid-80s, telecoms was a monopoly business. Virtually every country in the world ran telecom services as a monopoly. In most parts of the world, it was a government monopoly, although in North America, it was a private monopoly, but it was a monopoly also. And so anyway, I had got back to India in the early 90s, and I actually reconnected with an old friend and was catching up with him. And I mentioned to him about my interest and my involvement in the telecom space, and particularly in the regulatory side of things. And he, in his words, said, I'm knee deep into this because he was in the Ministry of Finance. And he said, do you think you can see me in my office tomorrow? I did. And as it turned out, they had just then set up a group to actually to advise the government on how to open up the telecom sector, and also to set up for the first time a regulatory body for telecommunications in India. So this was a small group, and I was the policy advisor. The report dealt with two specific cases. One was, if the private sector was to enter the telecom sector, what would be the terms and conditions, and what would be the way we would do it. And the second part, with which I was even uh, more closely connected, was regulation, which was about setting up a telecom regulatory body for India. So we actually worked on why it was required, what kind of functions were needed to be carried out, what kind of powers such a body might have, what kind of relationships it might have with the various stakeholders in the industry. So that is how it came about.
So it's interesting to me that the national telecom policy itself came about in 94, but the decision to kind of have a regulatory body sort of came up like 3 years later. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's very interesting because the work done to set up the regulatory body had actually more or less finished in 93 itself, early 94. And in fact, the telecom policy formally was pronounced actually in the middle of 94 in May. And in fact, the body itself came up in 97. It was set up in 97. And actually, that itself was, well, I think even by hindsight, and perhaps even then we knew was a major mistake. Because in 95 itself, the telecom sector had been opened up to some extent, and private players were already operating. And as I mentioned earlier, this was the time, a few years after deregulation had started in the telecom sector the world over. Some problem?
I know there's some issue with the mic. Can we just jump the mics? Is that okay? Am I audible?
Yeah.
I think we should just jump the mics,
Right.
yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Just speak a little louder.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's not. So, yeah. So the need for a regulator was certainly recognized across the world. and almost everywhere where they introduced competition in the telecom sector, they did it almost simultaneously in many cases, even even after setting up of regulatory bodies. But in India, for various reasons, I guess of political economy, we actually did not do that. We actually waited till much later to set up the regulatory body, and we paid for that too.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. I'm actually curious to get in the audience, right? Any people in their 20s here? I know Ahasya is, you are. Do you know what a landline is? Oh, you do? Oh my gosh. Did you at some point know that incoming calls were charged in this country? Like if somebody called you on your phone, you too had to pay. Did you know that? He clearly does not.
You not only had to pay, you had to pay big bucks. You had to
Yeah.
pay 16 rupees a minute.
Jesus Christ. So can we talk about that a little bit, right? So so how did some of those practices around interconnection and like incoming calls being charged, etc., sort of come to an end, especially in an industry that's really booming?
Well, actually, that I think before we get to that, we must also recognize what exactly happened when we decided to bring in private players in the telecom sector. And the first decision was to actually open up cellular mobile services. And it was decided that they would be open to two private players in each of the metros. They started with the metros, that's Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai. And, uh, and so they had some kind of a process which was itself quite contentious and led to a lot of litigation. But anyway, two players were chosen to actually to serve each of the metros. And soon after that, they had an auction to actually choose operators for each of the other circles, as they call them, which is roughly the equivalent of Indian states. So basically, to choose private players for the rest of the country. So this itself was, as I'm sure Ajay knows better than many, who was actually covering some of these things in his paper, it was a hugely contentious issue, lots of controversy, lots of scandal, and there was this company called the HFCL, which had bid close to 85,000 crores to get licenses for about 4 or 5 states or circles, as we call them in India's telecom, and this was far more than even some of the international majors had bid. So anyway, that happened, and of course that led to a huge lot of litigation. The rules got changed after the auction, and for at least a couple of years, we had the most bitter telecom coverage across in the country. In fact, actually, as I often mention, India is probably one of the only countries in the world where telecom is first front page news in newspapers. In fact, in most parts of the world, it's boring news on the business pages. But telecom sector, for some reason, has been lively right from the word go in India. So anyway, once the private players entered the market, they discovered, probably not to their surprise, but that the licenses were actually completely in favor of the existing player, which was in fact the government itself, as I mentioned. And a key problem there was that the interconnection rules were in favor of the government, and I think it's worth talking about interconnection for a minute or two. In fact, there is a saying in telecom that there are only 3 important issues in telecom: interconnection, interconnection, and interconnection. And, uh, and the reason was that, you can have the world's best technology, the best network, the largest amounts of funds to set up a network, say, in Goa. But the people who are going to use this network want to speak to everyone else, right? They don't want to just speak to their pals on the same network. So they want to speak to people in Delhi, they want to speak to the existing customers, they want to speak abroad, and so on and so forth. So the telecom network is actually a network which is totally interconnected across the world. And it is interconnected between commercially run businesses, right? Because obviously the players in India are very different from players in the UK or wherever, or in Ghana or wherever. So the and it's also interesting that if you're a new player, you need this interconnection far more than the existing player, because that existing player already has the customers, right? So while you desperately need interconnection, the the existing player is desperately trying to delay it, make it more expensive, to deny it, and to create all kinds of obstacles. And that is pretty much what happened. And the DOT, the government company, as well as MTNL, made life quite miserable when it came to interconnection. The rules for interconnection uh, were already in favor generally of the government, both commercially as well as technically, because remember, this interconnection is also is a technical issue. You really need to provide it at a certain place. You need to provide capacity, for example, how many calls can go up and down, and so on and so forth. And this became a major problem. So the licensing was extremely contentious, and interconnection was a major challenge.
So what happened? So the private players and the government are clashing, and you've got the regulatory body, and at some point the government is suing the regulator. How did
Yeah,
that happen?
yeah, and that really was quite an amazing story actually, because as I mentioned, unlike most other countries which chose to introduce competition in the sector, our regulator actually came much after that decision had been taken, and in some ways, for the regulator, it was a fait accompli, right? The market already had players, and the players were in bitter dispute with the government, because the government was not just the government; it was also a service provider. And so, when the body was set up in '97, a couple of years after the entry of private players, the within days, the regulator was inundated with complaints about what was happening with interconnection and this and that. And it was also uh, in, faced with another complaint by the operators, which was relating to the entry of the government service provider in the mobile sector. Because when the licenses were auctioned, the government had actually mentioned that there'd be two players in each circle, and this was a condition of this was the policy. And within literally a couple of years, the government decided that it also wanted to be a player in the mobile business, and and uh, in its government avatar, it decided to give itself a license to provide mobile services, which again the operators who were just 2 years old in the business said, look, this is not the deal we were given. We've invested in this business with with a certain sense of how many players there would be, what size of the market is, and so on and so forth. So they again complained to the regulator that, look, this was not our understanding, and this is not on. And as it turned out, the regulator decided, which was the new regulator, decided to deal with it like any other economic regulator would, and very much like what was happening in other regulatory bodies. It,
it actually ruled against the government in both cases. It said that, look, the interconnect rules were not fair, and it also said that uh, the uh, the government had no business to be licensing itself to offer these mobile services, because that was not the understanding that the private players were given. Now, as you can imagine, the government was just not amused by this, and because they actually did not even accept that the regulator had even the authority to do this, and so on and so forth. And and believe it or not, they decided to take their own new statutory regulatory body to court. Okay, and it was amazing weeks of serious court hearings with absolutely top shot lawyers of both sides appearing for both sides, etc. And guess what? The government won all its cases. And so so this really uh, sent the shivers in the private sector players, because they suddenly felt that they were in a business where the referee itself is compromised. If not compromised, is going to be extremely weak, and that it would not have the authority. So that really is what happened. And
Yeah. It is so fascinating to me, this point, right? Because if you look at any of the newer sectors, booming economies, all the founders fight for deregulation, right? I mean, you want fewer regulations, right? But in this industry, it's actually the presence of regulation, one could argue, that has enabled private players to sort of thrive, right? Which to me is really, really fascinating.
yes, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I like to say that telecom and maybe a couple of other infrastructure sectors are not just impacted by regulation; they are led by it. I mean, because even in an environment today when we have a totally more or less deregulated telecom sector, you still, for example, you need a license for a state. You cannot have, for example, Goa is a part of Maharashtra. Even if you had all the money and all the technology and all the willingness to do so, you cannot just simply decide to provide a telecom service in Goa, for example. So the region where you provide the service, the equipment you use, the standards you should follow, the security norms that you should comply with, etc., etc. Almost all of that is actually given to you by regulation. There are rules you should follow. And you can easily imagine that if, for instance, entry into this market is easy, then obviously it affects your business. If if the regulators are controlling prices in a certain way, it affects your business, etc. So unless the regulators are sensitive to, let us say, fair competition, sensitive to the need for quality, etc., etc., you can have a situation, which in fact we did have in the early parts of the deregulation in India, where we tried it without regulation, of course there were rules, but we didn't have a regulatory body. Because what you need is not just a regulatory body, you need an independent regulatory body, you need a competent body, because remember, you're talking about being a referee between a government and private players, and of course a referee between private players as well. Now, as we know, the role of government, or at least the share of government companies, has come down quite drastically. Uh, but still, the need for a referee is an extremely important requirement in telecoms, and actually the telecom business in many ways is made or lost or unmade by regulation. good regulation or bad regulation will make all the difference.
I want to ask you a little bit more about that court case,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to ask the audience, how many of you are on Airtel? Okay, Jio. Others? Okay, so I wanted to sort of talk about Airtel, right? Because I think when you talk about early private players, um, it's really Sunil Mittal who was an upstart, right? And he was really the equivalent of Sachin Bansals of today, right? In that sense.
He was.
Even though I always somehow assumed that he was a legacy business owner, right? So can you talk a little bit about what does it take for a founder like Mr. Mittal to go against Tata's and Reliance at that time and become a veritable force in this industry?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Varsha. Thank you. And the, in fact, I had the good fortune of observing Mr. Mittal quite closely in the early days, and his interest and belief that technology would make all the difference going forward was quite palpable even then. The other thing about him was that he was probably the only, before I go to that, his was amongst the smallest companies that actually were interested in the telecom sector. His company was less than a tenth of either Reliance or Tata's and various other companies that were there. Now, but he was one of those people who was probably the only promoter I remember who was there at all industry meetings. And it's also interesting that he comes, as some of us know, from a political background. His father actually was an MP, a member of parliament for Congress for many years. And so he has an appreciation for being, to avoid controversies, to try to be less adversarial. And you can actually see that, for example, almost every company in the telecom sector has been in the midst of controversy, litigation, etc. In terms of individual litigation, individual controversy, Airtel has seen the least of it. And also, I think Mittal had one other thing which I recall him mentioning in one of the meetings, that nobody has lost money with Airtel, he would say. That, none of our partners have ever lost money, whoever. But the other unique thing that Mittal did, which I think was innovative and everyone else copied after that, which was that he recognized that he had serious problems with actually capital. He had, telecom is an extremely capital intensive business. And there is no way that you can actually cover a whole country with infrastructure without actually having serious capital. So what he and his team innovated with was an arrangement with the telecom equipment manufacturers like Nokia and Ericsson, that instead of buying equipment from them, he would actually let them run his networks and pay them for the capacity used. And this actually worked brilliantly for him, because within almost comparable, and actually probably even faster than many of his competitors, he was able to roll out the network because he didn't have those huge investments to make in the equipment. So now, and some parts of his network were given to Nokia to run, some others to Ericsson to run, and so on and so forth. And it was immensely successful, and most of his competitors followed with pretty much the same format of letting the sorry, the equipment, the vendors to run the networks, and in the process avoiding upfront investments. And of course, one other thing for which I have no proof, but I think is very relevant, and that is that I believe that Airtel has probably made more crore-patis in its management than any other company has into the telecom.
More than Infosys?
I'm talking about telecom sector.
Okay.
But,
Right. Yeah.
but I don't think any of the telecom players have created more millionaires amongst its management than Airtel has. And that actually is something which I think has paid huge dividends to Sunil Mittal, which is that actually the management of Airtel has been amongst the highest profile in the industry. You would be hard pressed to name senior managements of most other telecom players, but if you are vaguely involved in the telecom sector, you would be able to name at least half a dozen people who would have worked for Airtel.
Yeah.
So, or who probably still are working with Airtel, because I think Sunil Mittal also recognized the professional aspirations of his own management team. So I think all in some of these things contributed.
Yeah.
And I think another actually, his ambition was actually visible quite early. In fact, I myself was involved in some of that, even when the telecom sector in India had not yet stabilized. He had already invested in a network in Seychelles and was running services. So there was, even before any, now of course Airtel has services in Africa, it has services in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh it had them, and various other places. But even when none of the bigger players were looking outward, etc., Sunil Mittal certainly was. So I think it's paid off well for him.
I just loved everything that you said right now, because what you said about like entrepreneurs being sort of wealth creators, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, one of our portfolio companies, Mintra, when asked about why he succeeded, he said nobody lost money with me, and
Yeah.
I think that is so important. And
Absolutely.
sharing wealth,
Yeah.
right? Amazing. I want to talk a little bit more, about Reliance and a bunch of other interesting things
Sure.
before we open it to the audience. But can we go back to that court case?
Mhm.
You said the government won the court case, right? Then how did the comprehensive telecom policy of 99 sort of come to be?
That's in fact the major milestone in the telecom sector, because I think once government won all its cases, there was major gloom in the private sector telecom industry. And of course, by then the sector also had fairly high-profile players. I mean, pretty much all of India's major industrialists were in one way or the other invested in the telecom sector. So there was a huge pressure on the government that, look, without a strong regulator, without a fair referee, there is no way that this sector can thrive. In fact, the companies were already struggling in the marketplace. The business was not taking off, partly because of the reasons you mentioned, because you had to pay to receive calls even, and I'm sure many of the people above 40 would have any number of stories about what people did when the calls had to be paid for. But that's a different story.
Missed calls.
Missed calls and all kinds of things. I remember meetings like this where somebody's phone would ring and they would let the phone ring all through till they left the room, because they didn't want to pick up the phone so that the clock starts ticking right away. Remember, those were, 16 rupees a minute was what the call was. But anyway, back to the point.
Yeah.
So the business wasn't taking off. And of course, the companies, high profile as they were also putting pressure on the government that, look, here was a sector which had, which clearly had huge promise but was about to close down. There was a risk of people not even being able to pay their license fees and stuff like that. And something very interesting happened. The government decided to take this on. The government actually changed policy. And one of the key features of that policy was that it actually cancelled and negated every single victory that they had had in the courts. Every single victory. They had you know, they decided that the regulator must be stronger, must be more independent. They decided that yes, the interconnection, all interconnection must be entirely and exclusively with the regulator, the TRAI. The tariffs must be entirely. In fact, even tariffs had been a problem because they had earlier, the TRAI had tried to stop this income, paying for incoming calls, and that too they had upset the government. And then, so all the powers relating to tariffs, to interconnections, were solidly given to the TRAI. It was given a role in the licensing that the government would not license anybody without consulting the TRAI. It was not going to be bound by that advice, but it would also not unilaterally license anybody, and so on and so forth. And the companies, because that's what they wanted, certainly were very pleased with it. And of course, in return, the government got two things, because the policy was a bit of a settlement. The companies agreed that okay, the government can be the third mobile player, and that if need be, there could also be more competition. So it was but the policy then met pretty much the needs of all three players. But the regulator was stronger, the private players had a much, and the government allowed something which actually the private sector had been gunning very strongly for, because they were unable to pay their fees. They had paid exorbitant sums of money to get their licenses, and the business wasn't taking off. So they wanted the government to allow them to move from a license fee regime to a revenue sharing regime. That look, we will share a certain percentage. It was said, then it was 15%, that we'd share 15% of our revenues going forward if you decide to waive this license fee. All this was agreed. And everything was fine. The government changed the TRAI Act to add all these new powers, etc., etc., and yet had the last laugh. They did everything except, and they didn't even tell the people involved, they sacked every single member of the body. All the senior leadership of the regulatory body was sacked. And I was told by the person himself that, look, we learned about this on television ourselves, right? That we had been. So anyway, whatever, the government made sure that, people were not kind of gloating over victories or whatever. And they made sure also that the new regulatory body, powerful as it was going to be, would have the members would have a shorter tenure than was there in the original this thing. So it used to be 5 years. Now they have only 3, and there were some restrictions placed, but by and large, it has that was a milestone, and within months of that change, the whole business of having to pay for local for your mobile calls actually stopped, and after which the sector just boomed exponentially.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to open it up for the audience, but I have a couple of more questions. Can I go ahead with that? Can the audience wait? Is that okay? Okay. So, for me as a professional, I think the biggest shift in this industry that has transformed my career is Geo, right? And so I'm sort of curious to understand why did it take so long for Mukesh Ambani to get into this space, and what stopped him from being a player sooner?
Well, there are two or three reasons. One is that, in contrast to Sunil Mittal and upstarts like Sunil Mittal, the, the bigger players were cautious. So actually, they were risk averse. In fact, in the earlier years of the business, uh, Reliance uh, did not even actually seek licenses in the bigger cities or more lucrative areas.
Was this
It,
Mukesh's or Anil's?
no, and this is, I was coming to that.
Yeah.
This was a time when Mukesh and Anil were together. This
Oh,
is
right.
This is
Right.
95, and they also made some bad moves where in their choice of technology. As you know, there was something called CDMA, etc., and they made some bad moves, and. And one of the big problems with that was also that the phone came with its own SIM card, which was, and you could not change it, so it was actually much less flexible. With today, for instance, in relatively modest homes, or people are able to share phones by changing SIMs. None of that was possible, etc. So there was that reason why they didn't come. Then around 2003, uh, we saw Mukesh version 1, where they suddenly crashed telecom fare tariffs. And there was this famous monsoon hangama, which offered phone services, handsets for 500 rupees and cheap. And that actually had a huge effect on expanding coverage, because now almost all working class people, whether it was the plumber, the electrician, and all of them, were able to not only afford those phones, but actually become far more productive, because now you didn't need a shop, you didn't need to be in a particular place to to seek or do your business and so on and so forth. So there was that. Then in 2005, I think, when Reliance had, the two brothers had a falling out after the death of their father. Uh, it was Anil who actually got Telecom as a part of the settlement. And, uh, and Anil and Mukesh are, it's fair to say, are a study in contrast. And in many, Anil is a financial wizard, or was considered. I think now the opinion is divided on that. But and Mukesh was a real infrastructure man. And but anyway, the even though Mukesh had been very much involved in the telecom sector and was arguably keener on the sector, and but it was Anil who managed to get control. And one of the parts of the agreement was that there was a non-compete
Right.
agreement. So for about 10 years, uh, Mukesh was obliged not to enter the sector. So then, when in 2010, when the 4G spectrum was auctioned, that's when uh, he came in. In fact, ironically, through the same HFCL itself, who sold their spectrum to him, and then of course he managed to have an all 4G network. In fact, he had an advantage with telecom. This is quite an important point, that he didn't have any of those legacy issues. He had no, so he was able to have a single technology network across the country. His own skills when it comes to delivering infrastructure, his companies are phenomenal.
Yeah.
So they were able to expand the network and crash the prices. And I think thanks to that, now we have some of the world's largest coverage of broadband, mobile broadband, and also some of the cheapest. And again, telecom is a vanilla product. So the moment somebody crashes the price, there is no other option but to simply follow suit. You can't just say, look, I have a better brand, or I have a, I'm more aspirational, or, because it's just connectivity. So in the process, everybody else also had to lower their prices, match them. And in the process, of course, many companies fell by the roadside. And now we have three left. Jio along with Vodafone and Airtel. And of course, the government operators are still there.
It's interesting you bring up Vodafone, because yesterday I sort of met the lady who made the Vodafone Zuzu ads. Do you guys remember?
Yeah.
I think, for me, like growing up, one of the fascinating things about Airtel and Vodafone is the advertisements.
Sure.
I just wanted to sort of pay a nod to that.
Sure.
But as you talked about prices crashing, right, I also want to talk about the Indian telecom customer a little bit, because I think we're
Sure.
really spoiled, right?
Sure.
In terms of price literally sort of being next to nothing, operation, number portability, right, costing zero, right?
Sure.
So many of these benefits for customers, right? And I don't think the Indian customers do recognize how lucky they are,
Well, you're right, they are quite lucky, and in some ways they are also beneficiary of some technology quirks, if you like. You see, for example, let's say a telecom tower, probably costs the same in India as it does, let's say, in Denmark. But one single tower in Denmark probably covers a few thousand people. The same tower connects a few 100,000 people in some cases, right? So the economics of that is easy to guess, that you're actually able to cover or to acquire more customers, a larger market with more or less the same investment.
Yeah.
So that does give you a lot of flexibility in pricing. Yeah. And so in fact, there are Indian customers. I mean, I don't think we are now the cheapest anymore, but we are amongst the world's cheapest. But I think somebody in Switzerland pays almost 20 to 30 times more than we do for a phone call or a phone service or broadband and so on and so forth. And you also mentioned number portability. That is actually, again, a major regulatory intervention. As it's probably amongst the easiest in the world to change your operator in India. For barely 19 or 20 rupees, you can just, within a period of 3-4 days, decide to take your business elsewhere. Right? You don't like Airtel, you go to Vodafone. You don't like Vodafone, you go to Jio or whatever. Right? Now, this moving between players has the operators are obliged to provide that service, and not only provide that service, but to provide it at that little price. And that, again, is a huge regulatory achievement in many ways, and it's worked wonders for competition. And of course, every player knows that the customer can punish you quite easily and quite fast if you're not up to the mark, and so on and so forth. It's a different matter that there are still challenges. We can discuss them if people are interested.
I just want to talk about net neutrality and AI before I sort of bring in the audience.
Sure.
How many of you remember the net neutrality debates? Okay, two people. I mean, so basically Facebook was trying to sort of impose their services onto Indian audiences with zero cost, right? And there was this whole debate about what is then fair play in the industry, right? Can you talk a little bit about that episode?
Sure. So, net neutrality is a concept maybe 30, 40 years old. Basically, it says that all internet content must be accessible at the same price. That essentially the equivalent of saying that the person who built the roads does not decide who uses it and for what purpose, etc. So here, basically, just because you own the telecom network, you don't decide what part of the internet should cost more to access and what should cost less. Irrespective of whether it's business content, social content, or even pornography, there is the net neutrality says everything must be accessible in the same way at the same price. So, and in Facebook introduced something called free basics. And their idea was that they would actually offer a subset of services which would be available without paying. Essentially, they would cover the cost of connecting to them. In other words, there will be no data charges for accessing those services. So this, of course, caused a lot of consternation amongst especially civil society people who believed that this would actually would be a breach of net neutrality principles, because now you're saying that a small group of websites would be free to the others, while the others would need to be paid for. Of course, the number of websites that they had chosen then were not that many, and of course, the people were opposed to the principle of it, and the TRAI took a very firm view that it was nobody was there would be no differential pricing of access. In other words, every single website would be accessible in the same way and at the same price. So the operators could not provide you preferential or access or at a differential price. So that's what happened. Of course, now net neutrality has evolved quite a bit, and there are countries with net neutrality and those without, and there's not much difference as that people have noticed, because the operators themselves have no major incentive to charge you more or less for something. So, or at least in practice, net neutrality, profound as a principle as it is, doesn't seem to have made much of a difference. The US, for example, had net neutrality, then got rid of it, then had it again. Now I think it's got rid of it again. But there's not much difference. So that is the other part.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting episode, because in India, at least, it was a people's movement, right? Like,
Yes.
people really pushed back on
Sure.
Facebook doing that.
Yeah, it's a major victory of civil society.
Yeah, for sure. As you talk about net neutrality, I'm also interested in talking about AI, what's happening now with AI, right?
Mhm.
And as a customer, I kind of feel like when search came about, it was practically free. If you had internet access, it was free. But you can't really say the same thing about AI, right? Because it's charged, right?
Mhm.
So which means that most people actually can't access something that potentially is eventually will become a fundamental human right? So where is regulation in AI, and with deep fakes and lots of other stuff that's happening, where is regulation in cybersecurity?
Very good question. The first answer to this is that we must not confuse AI as a network service,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, AI is like any other service that you pay for on the net. You want to subscribe to a newspaper which charges you. You want to subscribe to any entertainment or whatever, right? And so clearly there is AI that is free, and there is AI that is not free, and people have to take subscriptions.
Yeah.
So that is something that is at the internet stage, and that is not something that the TRAI comes into. However, there is, of course, the whole use of AI for the telecom network, right? And that, by all reckoning, is a good thing, because obviously that allows networks to be better purposed, better fine-tuned, and so on and so forth, gaps identified, and so on and so forth. But a concern when it comes to AI and the networks is, of course, that there is a huge amount of personal data that the telecom companies have, right? They literally know where you were 5 minutes ago, right? They know who you talked to. They have all your phone records, all your, who you talk long hours with, and whom you make short calls to, and etc. etc. They can pretty much, the AI allows them to actually to uh, to profile you in a way uh, that obviously can help them make more money and so on and so forth. Now that certainly is something that we will need to soon have some regulatory norms for, etc. This is an issue just now emerging, and we'll see where it goes. But yeah, what the telecom companies do with their data, right? And this data will is not only personal, it's huge quantities, and that number now is going to be many, many times more with 5G, because 5G has huge capacities when it comes to moving data. So now you're providing the telecom companies with massively personal, large quantities of monetizable data, data that they can make money out of. So that is something that obviously regulators uh, worldwide are concerned about, and we'll see how that goes.